Despite being one of the deadliest conflicts in recent times, the Congo Wars aren't a topic that's discussed very often in history class. At the turn of the century, while much of the Western world was focused on other news like NATO's bombing of Yugoslavia or the 9/11 attacks, Sub-Saharan Africa was in the middle of the biggest war of the continent's history. Through a tangled mess of alliances, nations, one after another, were pulled into the conflict, which ultimately resulted in the deaths of over 5 million people, making it one of history's bloodiest wars and earning it the nickname Africa's World War. Today, we're going to shed some light on the First and Second Congo Wars, one of the darkest periods of modern history. A story of war filled with corruption, greed, child soldiers, and the age-old battle for natural resources. The conflict we'll be covering today officially began in the mid-1990s, but as always, the seeds of the violence were planted much, much earlier. The European colonization of Africa is pretty widely known to have been violent and oppressive, but out of all the regions that were exploited for their people and resources, the Congo may have had it the worst. Situated right in the center of Africa and essentially dripping with every resource you can imagine, the Congo Basin was an imperialist's dream. Beginning in 1885, the area was called the Congo Free State and was privately owned by one man, King Leopold II of Belgium. And that's right, the country wasn't owned by the country of Belgium, it was literally the personal property of the king himself. For about 20 years, the Congolese people were subject to brutal exploitation, slavery, torture, and mass killings. His personal army forced the locals to gather monthly quotas of rubber, ivory, and other goods that he would export for profit. The details of the atrocities he committed are publicly better suited to their own detailed video, but suffice it to say, it's estimated that as many as 10 million people died under his rule from disease, starvation, and mass murder, possibly slashing the population of the Congo in half. In 1908, under pressure from the international community, Leopold II sold the region to Belgium, where it remained the Belgian Congo. Under Belgian rule, things improved a little bit, but that's not saying much considering how ridiculously low Leopold II has set the bar for running a colony. The Congolese were still under imperial rule, with much of the same forced labor and exploitation as before, just not quite on the same scale of genocide that had been seen in the decades previous. That all changed in 1960, when the Congo suddenly gained its independence from Belgium during the rapid decolonization period, and it was now called the Republic of the Congo, not to be confused with its northwestern neighbor, which was also called the Republic of the Congo. It's confusing, and they even had nicknames to distinguish them, like Congo-Leopoldville and Congo-Brazzaville, but that's neither here nor there because the name didn't stick around for very long. The first elected Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, had a vision to transform the newly independent Congo into a stable, self-sufficient nation. He was quite an inspiration, and Malcolm X even said he was the greatest black man who ever walked the African continent. He didn't fear anybody. But almost immediately after gaining independence, the Congo was thrown right back into instability. The problem was that even though there had been a huge push for the end of colonial rule, tribalism, ethnic nationalism, and widespread lack of education plunged the country straight into civil war just weeks after Belgium officially left. To be fair, Belgium essentially left overnight, leaving the country completely unprepared to govern itself after so many years. In this civil war, opposing factions rose up and fought each other in a period known as the Congo Crisis. This also allowed the Cold War superpowers at the time to choose a side and flood the area with weapons to support their ideologies, turning the civil war into a proxy war. Let's be honest, it was the 1960s. The US and the Soviet Union were involved in just about everything. During the crisis, Lumumba was assassinated by a Western-backed group, probably because he was appealing to the Soviets for assistance, proving that even though colonization had officially ended, international meddling wouldn't disappear so quickly. Then in 1965, Lumumba's successor was overthrown in a coup d'etat organized by the Congo military. This successful coup marked the unofficial end of the crisis, as much of the fighting died out, and it placed a new man in charge of the Congo, Joseph-Désiré Mobutu. Mobutu's full name, Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ngbendu Wa Za Banga, apologies for my pronunciation, translates to the warrior who leaves a trail of fire in his path. And he was certainly going to leave a trail of fire in the Congo, because as you'll soon see, he wasn't really a super great guy. In 1971, he renamed the country Zaire, and during his time in power, the country finally began to develop. A national TV station was set up, buildings and roads became a priority, and education even got some funding. He promoted a sense of Congo pride and even changed the names of cities away from their colonial roots, such as the capital, which he changed from Leopoldville to Kinshasa. And to get the country into the international spotlight, he hosted several sporting events, the most famous of which, by far, was the Rumble in the Jungle, a heavyweight boxing match between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman, which became one of the most watched television broadcasts of the 1970s. But as far as good things to say about Mobutu, that's pretty much the end of the list. At the beginning of his presidency, he had declared a state of exception and announced that in order to rebuild the country after the Congo Crisis, he would need to momentarily hold all of the power of government for 5 years to keep everything stable. Even after those 5 years were up, though, he continued to do all that he could to consolidate power and keep himself in charge. He claimed that his political ideology was neither left nor right nor even center. But this basically boils down to the fact that he only legalized a single political party, his, and he squashed any opposition. Oh, and there was also corruption. Of course there was. Lots and lots of corruption. Throughout his time in power, he embezzled billions of dollars from national profits and government funds and used them to fuel his cronies' businesses, shopping sprees in Europe, or even flights on the luxurious Concorde. Because of Mobutu's strong anti-Soviet stance, Zaire received a lot of economic aid from the US and Western Europe, but he just turned this into a new source of income and even halted his own country's growth to ensure a steady stream of international aid, most of which went straight into his filthy pockets. Ruling with an iron fist isn't a great way to gain favor with your people, and stealing from the national treasury every weekend to fund your golfing trips is a quick way to hit record high inflation and bring about serious economic problems. By the 1990s, these issues were adding up, and Mobutu's time as the absolute leader of Zaire was running out. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the United States no longer saw communism as an existential threat to the planet. This meant that Zaire, who had been essentially propped up to keep the Soviets out of Central Africa, didn't serve much of a purpose to Western alliances anymore, and economic aid began to just fizzle out. Now, this wouldn't be so much of a problem if the millions and millions of dollars that the West had already given Zaire were put into anything useful, but as we already mentioned, with Mobutu in charge, that just wasn't the case. After the aid began to shrink, the economy began to steadily drop, diving deeper and deeper into billions of dollars in debt. But still, Mobutu held his position of power and refused to move. It was going to take an outside force to shake up Zaire. Just to the east lay the nation that would become the catalyst for the war, Rwanda. In 1994, ethnic tensions in Rwanda reached a breaking point between the Rwandan Hutu and the Rwandan Tutsi people, and what followed was a genocide of between 500,000 and 1 million Tutsi. Again, just like with Leopold's brutal reign in the Congo, we just can't do this topic justice in a single video, but we'll sum up the very important parts for our story. Under the leadership of Paul Kagame, the Rwandan Patriotic Front succeeded in overthrowing the Hutu government after shooting down the previous president's plane. Hundreds of thousands of Tutsi had already fled to Zaire during the conflict, and after Kagame rose to power in Rwanda, vowing to take revenge on the Hutu, hundreds of thousands of Hutu fled across the border as well. Eastern cities in Zaire became massive refugee camps and housed nearly 1 million people that had fled Rwanda, with many of them camped out near the city of Goma. But Kagame wasn't going to let his enemies get away so easily. He was determined to hold the Hutu accountable for their atrocities in Rwanda, but Zaire wouldn't allow him to move his army across the border to hunt them down. Kagame knew that he couldn't risk using his army to officially invade Zaire over this, so instead he founded the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo, or AFDL for short. The AFDL was a militia that would carry out Kagame's dirty work in Zaire by exacting revenge on the Hutus that had found refuge there after escaping Rwanda. But that wasn't all the AFDL would achieve. Because so much of Zaire was fed up with Mobutu at this point, who was essentially a dictator, the idea of a revolution was popular among a lot of people, especially in the eastern Congo, and the AFDL quickly drew in support, not just as an anti-Hutu squad, but also as a general domestic uprising against Mobutu. The AFDL was led by Laurent-Désiré Kabila, a man who had been waging war in eastern Zaire for decades at this point. He was a Marxist and idolized Mao Zedong, and he wanted nothing more than to take down the mighty Mobutu. Under his leadership, the AFDL began engaging with Zairean forces in 1996, kicking off what's usually referred to as the First Congo War. The AFDL made short work of Mobutu's forces in the east and quickly captured a lot of the border villages and cities, making sure to execute any and all Hutus in the process. Though the AFDL was initially meant to be made up from only Tutsi and local Zairans, it also had regular members of the Rwandan army among its ranks. Mobutu soon realized that he had no chance against the AFDL and had little influence in the eastern portions of Zaire, so he began hiring foreign mercenaries, many of whom were veterans of the Yugoslav wars or soldiers from Chad, all of whom were experienced fighters. At the same time, Mobutu was also receiving aid from China, Israel, and France. France even wanted to directly intervene with their own military, but the US convinced them not to, probably because the US was funding the rebels. Kuwait supposedly sent Zaire $64 million to spend on military hardware, but later denied doing so. So it seemed like Mobutu had quite a lot of international support, and with all this aid, he was now ready to combat the growing rebellion. But before he could muster his forces for a counter-offensive against the AFDL, another country entered the war in 1997, Angola. Sitting to the southwest of Zaire, Angola was eager to help with taking down Mobutu because he had been funding UNITA, a rebel group that was fighting the Angolan government. Along with Angola, Eritrea sent an entire battalion to fight the rebels, and several African countries sent military aid, all with their own reasons for wanting to topple Mobutu, including Uganda, Tanzania, and South Africa. With so much firepower and support from nearby countries, Kabila and the AFDL launched their offensive towards the capital, Kinshasa, in March 1997, with a two-pronged attack beginning in the east. Mobutu's forces were disorganized, and many deserted from their ranks, so the AFDL met little resistance on their path. Along their way to the capital, they slaughtered civilians, they burned villages, they massacred anyone they deemed against their cause, killing an estimated 60,000 people. Throughout the entire march along the Congo River, which lasted a couple of months, the international community repeatedly called for a diplomatic solution to the war, and AFDL representatives even attended the meetings, but they only did it to avoid more criticism after their inevitable victory. They never had any intention to negotiate. Despite lacking traditional logistics and food supplies, the AFDL and their Eritrean battalion managed to march all the way to Kinshasa and meet up with the Angolan forces and take control of the capital. On May 16, 1997, Mobutu fled to Morocco, where he died later that year. Zaire's government had officially been overthrown. The revolution had been a success, but at a cost of an estimated 250,000 lives and hundreds of thousands of refugees. Kabila was elected the new president of Zaire, the first to be democratically elected since Mobutu took power decades earlier. One of his first acts as leader was to change the name of the country to the Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, the name which the country still holds to this day. He immediately ordered a violent crackdown on the entire nation to restore order, but that was easier said than done. Not long after the newly named DRC had stood on its own 2 feet, it was headed down the path of war once again. Kabila was somewhat popular when he was first elected, but his popularity steadily dropped in the months following his election. He had promised to bring the DRC into a new era of peace and stability, but his government was disappointingly similar to Mobutu's. When he reformed parliament and changed up the structure of the government, he not only placed a lot of his friends in parliament, but also made sure to centralize more power to his own presidential seat. Go figure, the warlord from the jungle was a little bit corrupt. What do you know? The economy continued to sink like the Titanic, and ethnic tensions were arising once again in the eastern part of the country. Basically, a lot of the same problems that plagued Mobutu's Zaire were still around in the new DRC, just with Kabila at the head. Much of the population began to see him less as the president of the DRC and more as a puppet of the foreign powers that put him there. Indeed, there were still foreign soldiers in the capital and several Ugandan and Rwandan military officials holding positions in the DRC, and the Congolese didn't like that one bit. In 1998, Kabila, under pressure from his people and stuck between a rock and a hard place, ordered all foreign military to get out of the Congo. Within 24 hours, all foreign soldiers and officers were loaded onto planes and flown to their home countries, including a man named James Kabarebe, a Rwandan who had previously been Kabila's chief of staff. Kabila was hoping that this move would assert his own rule over his people and show his willingness to be independent, but all it did was turn his foreign allies against him and stoke the flames of rebellion that were still raging in the jungle. As the Rwandan soldiers left the DRC, Kabila was already facing more problems. An entire Congolese brigade, mostly made up of Tutsis, announced their defection and took control of the eastern city of Goma, calling themselves the Rally of Congolese Democracy, or RCD. Rwanda instantly offered them military support, and by mid-August 1998, the RCD was a formidable militia with serious weapons and numbers. They began raiding and occupying nearby cities such as Uvira and Bukavu, and as usual, they slaughtered hundreds in the process. At the same time, Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi marched across the Congo border with their own armies occupying huge swaths of territory in the northeast. This was the beginning of the Second Congo War, and it would make the first one look like a schoolyard fistfight in comparison. Rwanda claimed that much of the territory in eastern Congo was actually historically Rwandan, and that Kabila was actively committing a genocide against the Rwandan Tutsis in the region, forcing their hand to intervene and liberate them. If that sounds familiar, it's probably because it's shockingly similar to what Vladimir Putin said about parts of Ukraine. This kind of rhetoric is historically perfect for stirring up your country to go to war. It's still debated to this day whether or not the Rwandan government was sincerely concerned about their people, or if they were just using it as an excuse to annex territory that they kind of wanted. Regardless of their intent, their armies were marching deeper and deeper into Congo every single day. In a desperate move, Kabila then appealed to the Hutu living in the DRC, turning them into an ally with the Tutsi as their common enemy. Intense combat began erupting all over the country as Congolese forces and Hutu clashed with the rebels and invaders, and the rest of Africa scrambled to bring a diplomatic solution to the table. But there was just no chance. Later, Kabila began to turn public sentiment against the Tutsi, and there was chaos in Kinshasa as hundreds of them were beaten or lynched in the streets. It only got worse when a radio message was broadcast throughout the country urging people to fight the Tutsi, saying people must bring a machete, a spear, an arrow, a hoe, spades, rakes, nails, truncheons, electric irons, barbed wire, stones, and the like, in order, dear listeners, to kill the Rwandan Tutsis. If anything, what Rwanda had initially said about Tutsi genocide was only coming true. The RCD and their foreign allies went on their first major offensive of the war just days after it began, when they commenced Operation Kitona, overseen by James Kabarebe, the man that Kabila had fired only weeks earlier. In a daring move, Kabarebe and a group of Rwandan soldiers took control of the Goma International Airport and hijacked 4 passenger jets, 2 Boeing 707s and 2 Boeing 727s. The pilots were then held at gunpoint and forced to fly to Kitona, a town southwest of Kinshasa, all the way on the other side of the country. The moment the planes hit the tarmac, the Rwandan soldiers deployed the air stairs and jumped off the plane while it was still taxiing. The Congolese forces that were supposed to be defending the airport were overrun within 30 minutes, and many of them even accepted a quick bribe to join Rwanda's side. The 4 planes made repeated flights back and forth between Kitona and Goma, bringing more equipment, troops, and even Type 62 Chinese light tanks. The total force at Kitona, consisting now of Rwandan, Ugandan, and DRC defectors, began to launch attacks on nearby cities. In just a few days, they captured major oil refineries and the towns of Banana and Boma, marching deeper inland. On August 4, 1998, the invading force captured the city of Matadi, the Congo's most important seaport, and then seized the Inga Dams, 2 hydroelectric dams that power the capital, Kinshasa. After the dams were put out of commission, Kinshasa went into a total power outage, bringing the population into even more panic and threatening to disconnect Kabila from escape. Luckily for Kabila, he had a friend waiting to join his side in the conflict: Zimbabwe. Kabila had been speaking with Zimbabwe about military assistance since before the war even began, and true to their word, they showed up to fight. By August 22nd, Zimbabwe's military in the DRC consisted of over 800 troops, several aircraft, armored vehicles, and over a dozen helicopters. The air support especially proved vital in defending Kinshasa, as the advancing Rwandan tanks were completely unprepared to deal with fighter jets. The only anti-air weapons they had were vehicle-mounted anti-air guns, but they lacked training and experience to use them effectively against quick fighter jets. At one point, a Zimbabwe Air Force helicopter spotted a column of tanks just 30 kilometers south of the capital, and after coordinating with nearby fighter pilots, several of the tanks were destroyed and the rest were captured by DRC ground troops. Around the same time that Zimbabwe joined the war, Angola, who had helped put Kabila in power, also pledged their support, and 2,500 Angolan soldiers quickly moved across the border and retook the airfield at Kitona, meaning that Kabarebe and his forces had no way to fly back to safety if things went south. As the Angolan forces retook villages and towns, they looted them in an even more vicious manner than the Rwandans had, subjecting the locals to brutality when they were expecting to be liberated. Kabarebe was now cut off from his airfield and surrounded on several sides by the DRC, Zimbabwe, and Angola, but he still had around 15,000 men, and he decided to continue the ruthless push towards the capital. At the end of August, Kabarebe and his men made it to the outskirts of Kinshasa and waged an intense battle to take the airfield on the edge of the city. They tried bombing it, charging it, and even disguising themselves as defectors, but they made little progress and were only able to take partial control of the airport. On the second day of fighting, Kabila's forces launched a huge counterattack, pushing the Rwandans away from Kinshasa and further south, largely thanks to Zimbabwe airstrikes that ran sortie after sortie for hours on end. 2 days of trench warfare followed before Kabarebe finally decided to retreat, fleeing into the dense jungle. But now Kabarebe was faced with an even bigger problem. To the north of his men lay the Congo River, which he couldn't cross or use because he didn't have any boats. To his west lay Kitona, which the Angolans were now defending, and to his east lay hundreds of miles of dense jungle. In a desperate attempt to escape, he and his men continued to march south, heading for Angola. While the Angolans were busy in the Congo retaking the Inga Dams, Kabarebe and his remaining battered troops crossed the border and headed for an airfield outside the Angolan city Maquela de Zombo. After joining up with some allied rebels in the region, UNITA, they seized the airfield and waited for Rwandan cargo planes to airlift them back to safety. But once the Rwandan cargo planes landed, they were faced with another issue. The runway wasn't built for heavy cargo planes, and it was far too short to use for takeoff. So, for the next couple of months, Kabarebe and his men got to work extending the runway, all while somehow fending off repeated Angolan attacks, one of which consisted of over 20 armored vehicles. Miraculously, this worked, and by December the runway was completed and all remaining Rwandans and Ugandans were flown back to their home countries. This marked the end of Operation Kitona, but the war raged on elsewhere. After Operation Kitona had been successfully thwarted, the DRC and their allies turned their attention to the battles raging in the east. This is the point where more and more African nations began sending troops to fight for their interests in the Congo. So let's recap who's fighting for what, because it's all a bit complicated. On the invading side, we have Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi, as well as their Congolese militia groups, the Rwandan-backed RCD and the Ugandan-backed MLC. Yeah, they each back their own group despite supposedly being on the same side of the conflict. And let's not forget UNITA, the anti-Angolan forces. Meanwhile, on the defending team, we started off with the Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, Zimbabwe, and local Hutu forces that were now allied with Kabila. But once the war started heating up, several more players joined the match. Namibia, Chad, and Sudan, all with their own political or financial reasons for supporting DRC. Also allied with Kabila were several militias scattered throughout the opposing countries. This absolute mess of complicated alliances is the reason that the Second Congo War is sometimes referred to as the African World War, as it is rather reminiscent of Europe's Great War that pulled so many countries into the fray, with even more supporting their allies from the sidelines. Around 1999, the fighting was held at a relative stalemate along the front lines in the eastern DRC, with no major territorial gains or large-scale operations by either side. This doesn't mean that the bloodshed was any less significant, though. In fact, quite the opposite. Throughout the entire conflict zone, villages were razed and looted, and civilians were slaughtered remorselessly. One of the most heinous aspects of the war at this point, and the most shocking to the rest of the world, was the use of child soldiers by both sides. They're known in the Congo as Kadogos, a Swahili word that means little ones. At least 30,000 Kadogos were hired or conscripted throughout the Second Congo War, some as young as 12 years old. As leaders around the world scrambled to find a solution to the conflict, a ceasefire was miraculously agreed upon. In July 1999, each of the warring nations signed the Lusaka ceasefire agreements, which stated that all military operations would cease within 24 hours, prisoners of war would be released, and the United Nations would place observers in the area to make sure the ceasefire was being obeyed. Funnily enough, though, Chad didn't sign the agreement because they'd already withdrawn from the conflict just a few weeks after entering it. Their forces were accused of so many war crimes from the moment they crossed the border that both international and local pressure had just forced them to return home. But as you may have guessed, ending such a complex war wasn't going to be so easy as signing a few bits of paper. In the months after the agreement was signed, every side accused the other of breaking the ceasefire and retaliated often. So essentially, there were still battles being fought all over the front lines, and the measly 90 UN observers were far too small of a force to have any effect on the hundreds of thousands at war. Not to mention the RCD, the Rwandan-backed militia in the Congo, were splitting into rivaling factions who were now fighting each other as well as their traditional enemies. Things got even more complicated in August 1999 when Rwandan and Ugandan soldiers opened fire on each other in the city of Kisangani. Tensions between the two nations had been rising for a while, but this was the first time they'd been in official combat with each other. There was now a three-way war, every nation for himself. The former allies battled intensely for a few weeks across Kisangani, with both sides even using heavy weapons such as artillery, but eventually they signed a ceasefire later that month. Now, this probably won't be much of a surprise anymore, but that ceasefire also didn't accomplish very much. Rwanda and Uganda kept up the hostilities, but at least on a smaller scale for the moment. In November, Kabila claimed that his army, thanks to military aid from his allies, was now fully trained, equipped, and ready to start a massive new operation to liberate the occupied territories of the Eastern Congo. In response, several factions of rebels gathered to march to Kinshasa, but they were successfully repelled by government forces before reaching the capital, and Kabila's operation ended with no noticeable difference in the front lines. As the year 2000 began, the UN started sending more and more peacekeeping troops, with a total force of 5,537 eventually stationed in the Congo. But they still struggled to have any semblance of control over so many warring factions. Throughout the rest of 2000, heavy fighting resumed between Rwanda and Uganda, and the DRC government made several attempts to push into rebel territory, but to no avail. With governments distracted and police forces essentially non-existent, it was like an all-you-can-eat buffet for terrorist groups such as the Christian extremist organization LRA, who murdered, burned, and looted wherever they pleased, with virtually no one to stop them. People were dying all over the country. Entire villages were starving to death as their farms burned, and thousands of women became victims of sexual violence. Throughout all of this, every organization you can imagine did their best to negotiate peace, but all to no avail. Much of this was even the fault of Kabila, who refused to let UN troops into the government-controlled areas, while simultaneously launching new offensives despite the ceasefire. The war seemed to be doomed to an endless bloody stalemate. But then something rocked the entire political climate. On January 16, 2001, Kabila was assassinated, shot 4 times with a revolver in the abdomen by his own child soldier bodyguard. After his death, the Congolese parliament voted unanimously on the next president, Kabila's son, Joseph. Joseph Kabila would soon prove to be much more willing to negotiate than his father. Just a few weeks after his election, he flew to the United States and met with Rwanda's President Paul Kagame, and the two agreed on a new UN de-escalation plan. In February 2001, Rwanda and Uganda began to pull their armies back away from the front lines, but continued to battle as the rebels they had been supporting began to turn on them. By 2002, the Sun City Agreement was signed, and remarkably, it put an end to much of the conflict. Some rebel groups even agreed to the ceasefire, and others slowly reduced their overall involvement. Depending on how you define a war, the Second Congo War could be considered an ongoing conflict, as several regions of the Congo are still incredibly dangerous, and fighting continues to this day, 2 decades later. Between 1998 and 2008, over 350,000 people were killed as a result of violence, and an estimated 5.4 million people died from starvation or disease when their villages were wiped off the map, making it the deadliest war in the history of the African continent and among the deadliest in human history. Decades of corruption and violence have left their mark on the DRC. According to the Human Development Index, the Democratic Republic of Congo is ranked 175 out of 189 countries. 23% of the adult population is illiterate, and an estimated 50 million Congolese don't have regular access to clean drinking water, despite their country having more than half of the total fresh water reserves of Africa. And it turned out that Joseph Kabila, though a much more level-headed politician than his father, was still pretty corrupt, and though inflation had gotten more under control, much of the public funding and international aid in the Congo was still being funneled straight to politicians' pockets instead of to schools, roads, and hospitals. But on the bright side, there are signs of improvement in the region. In the 2018 general elections, Félix Tshisekedi replaced Joseph Kabila in the first peaceful transition of power since the country's independence from Belgium in 1960. The natural resources, especially copper and cobalt, give the DRC perhaps the richest natural reserves in Africa, and Chinese investment into their infrastructure could be a good chance to rebuild certain parts of society. We'll see down the road how the deal with China turns out, but for now, it seems to be just what the DRC needs. Today, the armed conflict between various rebel factions continues in the eastern provinces of the DRC, though on a much smaller scale than before, and the number of child soldiers has shrunk every year since the fighting began. For the sake of the 89 million people that live there, let's hope that the Second Congo War was the last of its kind, and that the DRC can finally escape corruption, instability, and the ghost of the brutal imperialism that started it all. So this video has been all about a very long war. If you'd like to watch the exact opposite of that, we got a video all about history's shortest war, lasted barely a day. Gonna link to that on the screen right now. Check it out, and thanks for watching.